Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. All right, everybody ready for the 3 p.m. late afternoon? I know you want a nap session. Well, thank you so much, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you folks today to share a little bit of the work that I've been doing over the last few years, considering climate and again, how it's related to graduate student experiences. So the title of my talk is Reconsidering Climate in Graduate Education, Student Experiences and Institutional Strategies to Improve Student Outcomes. And I'd like to start kind of where your conversations this morning left off. I know that you folks have spent the morning thinking about access, thinking about admissions, and how do we increase the enrollments of the number of students from underrepresented backgrounds. I think a lot about underrepresented racial minority backgrounds, so Black, Latino, Native American students in graduate education. And I want to push us a little bit to think about the fact that while we have a long way to go in terms of enrollments, we have made some slow and steady progress in recent decades. So the data that you see on the screen is from the National Center of Education Statistics, and it shows the percentage of all graduate students that are represented by different populations. So we see that over time, if we compare 2000 to 2008, there has been some growth in the percentage of graduate students who are African American, who identify as Latino, or who identify as Native American. Native American numbers have been stalled for a very long time and are under 1%, and we really need to do more work in that area in particular. But as we think about and talk about this growth, I think it's important for us to continue to have conversations about admissions, but also not to forget about students once they actually enroll in their programs. Right? And there are two particular things that I want to talk about today. The first being retention. And I think with both of these issues, they are global issues, and then there are specific issues when we're talking about communities of color. So with graduate student retention, there's been this low-level and sometimes high-level conversation about the fact that we often lose graduate students generally, that the graduate student doctoral completion rate is at about 57%, and that research suggests that Black students, Latino students, Native American students, and particularly students of color who are women, graduate at even lower rates. So we really do need to think about retention-related issues. In addition to retention, I'm increasingly thinking about how enrollments and retention are connected to the diversity in the professoriate. So when we look at faculty representation and whether or not there are changes in the diversity in the professoriate, an effort that we've been spending a really long time and a lot of effort really trying to reconsider how to make movement on that particular area, we see that there's been very little change in terms of faculty diversity. That over the last 30 years, the number or the percentage of faculty members who are Black, Latino, or Native American has grown from 7 to 11%, right? So that's not very much growth over a very long period of time, considering the amount of time and energy and resource that we're placing. So I think for me, this really turns our attention to thinking more critically about what's happening in graduate programs and how students are experiencing those environments, in addition to our efforts to bring in more diverse populations. So I'd like to turn our attention to thinking about climate as one of the reasons why we might see some challenges and some difficulties in terms of retention and see lower numbers or smaller percentages of students expressing interest in pursuing faculty careers. So when we talk about climate, it might be a term that you've heard thrown around quite a bit, and it really comes from organizational learning and organizational development. And it was really brought to the field and the conversation about diversity and equity in higher education by Sylvia Hurtado, Jeff Milam, Alma Clayton-Pedersen, and Walter Allen. And in 1998 and 1999, they really pushed us to think about the multidimensional nature of climate, which can be understood as the attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs in a campus community around issues of diversity. The short litmus for this is really like, how does the campus feel? Does it feel welcoming? Do you feel like you have a sense of fit? Do you have a feeling that you have a sense of belonging? And while we can look at questions like that across an entire campus community and see that, hey, students are pretty satisfied and they feel like they fit, often when we disaggregate that data by racial and ethnic identity, we find that students of color report lower levels of fit and a less positive perception of the campus climate. Researchers over the last several decades have shown that climate can have a powerful impact on students' experiences and outcomes. That ultimately, climate has been linked to retention and achievement. It's been linked to the development of habits of mind and lifelong learning. And finally, it's been linked to competencies and the ability to navigate in a multicultural world. So for students that have exposure to a very positive campus racial climate, we see positive outcomes across all of these three things. But for students who have exposure to more negative or more hostile or more chilly climates, we see that they're less likely to be retained, they report lower levels of achievement, and in particular, there's been such a rich conversation about the benefits of diversity in learning that when you're exposed to people from different perspectives than your own, that our thinking is better, that we're able to be more innovative, that we're able to be more creative, that we're able to critically solve problems in a better way. If we just bring together folks from diverse backgrounds and don't create inclusive climates, then ultimately that learning doesn't take place. So that the climate piece is really the piece that we need to be focused on and thinking about. I would also say that while climate models have been focused on undergraduate education, it's been less likely been the focus of study in graduate education or using climate frameworks as a model. So increasingly, colleagues are looking towards how do we take these climate ideas and these climate frameworks and use them to understand what's happening in graduate education. Ultimately, it functions a little bit different than undergrad education, right? We might talk about campus racial climate in undergraduate education, but more often in the graduate world, I find myself talking about the climate of science as an enterprise or the climate within a particular department, a program, or a laboratory. So you'll hear me talking about climate in those ways today. So when we look at the work that Sylvia Hurtado and Jeff Milam in particular have done to expand our notions of climate and what it is and how we measure it and understand it, they talk about the different factors and forces that ultimately influence that climate, that way that folks feel in a campus environment. First, they acknowledge that there are external forces outside of whatever context we're talking about, there's gonna have an influence on the climate that folks experience, right? So if we think about current government policy, if we think about the region of the country that we live in, that ultimately those things are going to have an influence on what happens in campus communities. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to keep that in mind. However, they also talk about the multiple internal forces that ultimately can have an influence on a climate. The first one is often the first one that campuses, programs, departments turn to that in many ways you folks are having a conversation about today in terms of improving climate, and that's compositional diversity. So it's literally counting numbers. How many people do you have from each group present in an environment? And while that ultimately does have an influence on climate, that ultimately does create those conditions that allow diversity to really be actualized and for that learning, that really rich learning to take place, there are all these other dimensions that we have to think about. One of the least studied in higher education research is the historical legacy of inclusion or exclusion in the campus community. It's really hard to totally change a ship or move a ship in a different direction when it has a history of being an exclusionary place, right? So I think about my own campus. The University of Maryland was a segregated institution, so it took them years to really think about and talk about what did that mean in terms of creating a hospitable climate now for Black students. The ones that we more often talk about are the psychological climate, the behavioral climate, and increasingly talking about organizational climate. So psychological climate is often how we measure climate to begin with. It's how the environment feels to people. Does it feel warm? Does it feel chilly? Does it feel inclusion? Do you feel a sense of inclusion? Does it feel exclusionary? So when we ask folks like how do they feel in an environment, do they feel welcome, we're asking them about the psychological climate. The behavioral climate is the quantity and the quality of interactions across difference. So we're really trying to get a sense of who do folks collaborate with? Who do they talk to inside the laboratory, outside of the laboratory? What is the quality of their relationship with their principal investigator, not just do they have a mentor? So really trying to get a sense of what do those interactions look like across difference in a meaningful way. And then finally, increasingly, folks are looking at how structures and organizations can also feed into climate, how things like admissions policies ultimately can influence the environments that folks are in, and how things that may appear value neutral may ultimately disadvantage communities of color because they're long-standing policies or that they don't necessarily take into account different disparities that might take place in certain communities, right? So I imagine you folks talked a good bit about the GRE this morning, how an emphasis on the GRE, for example, could disadvantage or create a more hostile climate for students from underrepresented backgrounds. An example that I often use is if a student union was allocating student space based on the length of time that that organization was on campus, and it was a campus like mine, the University of Maryland, which was once segregated, and all of these very old student organizations would have priority in choosing space, then organizations that serve students of color would naturally be last in line because they haven't been on campus as long because the campus used to be segregated. Does that make sense? So something that on its face seems very fair ultimately can end up disadvantaging certain groups of students. So when we turn to using these dimensions of climate, this notion of climate as a tool, we can get a better understanding of some of the things that might be happening in terms of career development for graduate students once they're enrolled and how they make decisions about whether or not they want to stay in the academy, as well as these larger questions of retention. So today I'm going to talk about two different studies that I've been working on with colleagues at multiple institutions. And the first is having a conversation about what climate experiences look like and how they can influence career development for a group of African American scientists. The second study I'm going to talk about is on how institutions can start to think about addressing climate. And we're going to talk about graduate diversity officers, so individuals who have been hired into administrative roles, who have been put in place to help think about retention-related issues and how they think about climate in relation to their work. So the first study I've done in collaboration with Kenny Gibbs, John McGreedy, Jessica Bennett, and Shelvia English, and want to acknowledge them and their hard work, and also thank the Borough's Welcome Fund for their generous funding. And the second study I'm going to talk a little bit about was done in collaboration with Marcelo Muniz, Lorella Espinosa, and Ed Smith, and was funded by the NASPA Foundation and Penn State University. So just want to acknowledge everybody before I get started. Okay, so first we're going to talk about this study about African American scientists and their experiences and their career development and how climate is related to that picture. So, oh, that did not show up nearly as well as I thought it would. This data comes from a larger project that we were working on called the STEM PhD Careers Project. It's 3 studies within one larger study. The first study, we didn't really know much about career development at all. We knew that there were these broad trends where we see graduate students reporting less and less interest in pursuing academic careers, and had the sense that those trends looked different for women and for underrepresented minority populations, but really wanted to drill down and get an understanding of why that was happening. So in the first study, we did a series of focus groups with folks who were and were not interested in pursuing academic careers, but they all had already completed their PhDs. So we talked to folks who were within 5 years of completing. We used that data from our focus group study to develop a quantitative instrument that we ultimately administered to almost 1,900 individuals who had already completed their PhDs. Many were postdocs, not all were, but they had all completed their PhDs in the last 5 years. And we were asking those individuals to reflect back on their experiences, what drew them to graduate school, what were their interests at different points in time, what was the climate like in their labs as graduate students, as postdocs, to really start to try to quantitatively measure how did folks' interests change over time and what factors and forces might be leading to some of those differences. So in that study, we ultimately ended up finding, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that while all students on average, our students reported declining levels of interest in pursuing faculty careers over time, those trends looked different for underrepresented minority participants. They looked different for women, and they looked particularly different for underrepresented minority women. So over time, groups that were underrepresented in the academy reported greater declines in their interest, with underrepresented minority women reporting the lowest levels of interest in pursuing faculty careers by the current time point that we were assessing. So we saw that a lot of that change happened in graduate school, and no matter what we put into the statistical model, we couldn't really figure out, we couldn't explain away that difference. We couldn't really suss out through quantitative measures like, well, what ultimately was leading to this difference? We were able to control for productivity, we were able to control for time to degree, we were able to control for their relationships with their advisors, so a whole bunch of things that we assume are related to their ultimate success and their decisions to pursue faculty careers. So we ultimately went in with study 3 and did in-depth interviews with almost 70 participants, a diverse group of folks, again, who had very diverse career interests to get a sense of how they actually made decisions over time. What different experiences did they have that made them more or less interested in pursuing faculty careers? So for this particular study that I'm going to share with you folks today, we asked 2 questions. The first being, how do Black science PhDs describe and navigate the racial climate in their laboratories, graduate programs, and the broader scientific community? We wanted to add to that, that wealth of literature to get a better understanding of what does climate actually look like in someone's graduate program versus on a campus-wide level. And then the second question was trying to get a better understanding of whether some of these climate-related issues ultimately might lead to increasing or decreasing folks' level of interest in pursuing a faculty career. So a quick overview of the methods. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about this, but folks can ask me questions afterwards if they have questions. But out of that larger group of 69 individuals that we conducted in-depth interviews with, we pulled out the 21 participants who were African American, 9 were women, 12 were men, and we took their survey responses. So we asked them to think back to before they started graduate school, at the end of graduate school, and currently, what was their level of interest in 4 different career paths. So we do have that data that we were able to use to ground our qualitative work. And then we conducted semi-structured interviews with each of these individuals that lasted, on the short end, 60 minutes, and on the long end, 2 hours. We then engaged in some team-based analysis strategies to make sense of the different themes emerging from the data, and really to get a consistent understanding of how folks were talking about their career development. So when we tried to answer the first question, when we wanted to get an understanding of what did climate look like for these individuals, how did they describe the climate of science, in their labs, in their programs, they very rarely talked about overt acts of racism, of hostile environments. They talked more about subtle forms of marginalization. So the overt acts that we saw were, there was one woman who was talking about having a very difficult series of interactions with her advisor, that he was mean to her, he demeaned her, and she described him as verbally abusive. And there was a moment when he lashed out and tried to kick her out of the lab, saying that most PIs don't accept minorities like myself. Most folks were not that explicit in terms of marginalizing their students. Students talked more about observing the ways that their peers interacted with each other, the ways that their PIs interacted with other students, and noticing that there was something different that they couldn't name. There wasn't the same level of closeness, but they didn't really know how to talk about it. They didn't know what it was about, right? They didn't know how to really describe it. So one man talked about doing research and wanting to publish it and his PI not letting him, and seeing other peers getting to publish their work and not being sure why that was the case or why that wasn't the case, and not ever really getting a good explanation around it. This woman, Denise, talked about coming to the lab, being really diligent about being there, not trying to make mistakes, and she had a white male colleague who was late, who sometimes wouldn't show up, and she felt like he got a pass, that he had it a little bit easier than her. And she saw how the PI treated her and treated her peer, and she said, I could see the contrast. I think that's what started to bother me after a while, that he was treating us differently, and I couldn't figure out why. So there was a lot of conversations around, like, I'm not really sure what's going on, but I can't put my finger on it, I can't put a name on it, but there's subtly something different where I don't feel fully included and welcome in this space in the ways that I see that my peers do. So when we took a step back and started to look at the patterns of interest across these 21 folks and wanted to get a sense of how did their interests change over time. Again, we had their survey responses, so we could see how they rated what their interests were at the beginning of graduate school and at the end of graduate school in terms of pursuing a faculty career. We saw that 13 reported a declining level of interest. They either went from somewhere from high to some interest to little to no interest over the time that they were in graduate school. 3 people maintained low levels of interest. They were never interested to begin with. And then 5 people maintained high levels of interest. So we had this big group of folks who talked about losing interest over the time that they were in graduate school. So when we went deeper into why they changed interest, like just really trying to get an understanding of what ultimately changed their minds, there was a question we even asked in our interview protocol, like, if the academy could do anything to have you back, is there anything that they could do? When we really dug into this data, we found that there was this acknowledgement of many of the reasons that we see students saying that, you know, they're not interested in being faculty anymore, that there's a low level of pay, particularly when you're thinking about becoming a postdoc or some postdocs for time. And then also that there was a relatively competitive job market and they weren't sure how successful they were going to be in that job market. However, they were more often influenced by their perceptions of climate, largely articulated through relationships with peers and faculty, as well as the perceptions of what science valued and how that aligned with their own individual identities. So there was this relationship in some ways that I'm going to try to unpack for folks here between compositional diversity, so seeing how underrepresented they were, the behavioral climate, the quality of their interactions with peers and with faculty, and then the psychological climate, how they felt and whether or not they felt like they fit and whether or not it was warm and inclusive for them to continue to want to stay in science. And that this triad ultimately had an influence on their self-efficacy, their perceived ability to do the work and be successful, and then their outcome expectations as well. So what will ultimately happen if I become a faculty member, and do I want to stay in this environment, right? So there's a lot of different things happening and going on. The second thing that we saw going on was that folks looked at the norms and the values of science. So again, this is part of the organizational climate piece, which seem objective, and they actually felt like, you know what, actually this doesn't align with who I am. And it also could be considered, I'd like to argue, as part of the climate, that the norms and values of science don't always feel inclusive for everybody, and that ultimately led to folks expressing that they weren't as interested in staying in the academy. So I'm going to offer some examples, I promise, and hopefully this will become more clear. So first, there was this link between underrepresentation, relationships, competence, and fit. So Luke is actually an interesting case. He was one of the few participants who maintained high levels of interest, right? So he says that, you know, I started graduate school being really interested in being a faculty member, and I ended graduate school wanting to be a faculty member. Now, there were ebbs and flows throughout that graduate school time, like for most folks, but he tells this very interesting story of starting graduate school, and other folks shared this and feeling like they're the only one, that there is nobody who looks like them, and feeling to some extent a little bit isolated in their environments, that they're worried about folks' knowledge about the stereotypes about African American students and what they know and what they don't know, so they're reluctant to ask questions, and just really feeling like they couldn't engage in the ways that other folks could. So in his first quote, where he's reflecting on the early part of his experience, he said, "I didn't feel like I could be ignorant in front of my advisor or in front of other students in my laboratory. Of course, it's like one of those things, you make the situation what it is based on your own inner perceptions of your own reality, but it was one of those things where I didn't have a cohort of individuals that I could completely identify with and that could identify with me," right? So he's feeling isolated and that he can't really be vulnerable and he can't really show what he does and doesn't know because he's the only one. He's the only one who looks like him. Now, as he continues in his program, he ultimately ends up connecting with a group of Black male scientists, right? And this is really transformational for him. He finds this African-American man who's a scientist who's hosting these events at his home for Black male scientists from other departments and programs. And he says, these were all just other African-American men in science, and some were in medicine, and we would meet once a month, and sometimes we would meet individually. It was just kind of a social thing where we would meet at the senior scientist's house. We would talk about what's going on in your lab, how are your classes going, your research going, and it was kind of different. It was like being at the barbershop, but we were talking about science and careers, right? So ultimately, having this environment where he was able to see himself, where he was able to connect with other folks that gave him that space to ask those questions and be vulnerable was something that was renewing for him. It gave him that sense of fit, where he ultimately was able to maintain his level of interest in being a professor. Everybody with me? Okay, great. So if we turn to that second point I was making about values, norms, and outcome expectations, that folks were very cognizant and aware of what the values and the norms were in science and what was most important. The question ultimately came down to whether or not that jived with who they were and whether or not they felt like they could be successful. So some of them were just objective observations of things. Sometimes we do not offer the best models of work-life balance as professors, and the graduate students are very keen observers of that. So there was a lot of vicarious learning happening, lots of graduate students watching the lives of their faculty members and making decisions about whether or not they wanted that type of life. So this woman talks about not only watching faculty members work really, really hard, she was an African-American woman and talked about watching African-American women work really, really hard. And she said that she observed all these professors' lack of work-life balance. And then in her mind made a connection to what she perceived as Black women getting stress-related diseases and decided for her that it wasn't worth it. That ultimately, I don't care about the number of publications and the number of grants, I wanted to have a life. So for her, the level of work life was not just an objective thing that she saw, it was very much connected to identity and her own health and her well-being and her decision about whether or not she fit. The participants also talked quite a bit about their perception of the balance of the work that they would do, feeling a love for research, enjoying research, having that be what drew them to the bench, but ultimately that many of them decided that they were in love with one of two things, either teaching or doing very practical research, that they wanted to solve very specific problems, and they weren't sure that they were going to be able to do that if they stayed in faculty careers. So this first quote here, I really love it because you can see her going back and forth in her mind about whether or not she'd like to be a faculty member. She ultimately reported that she didn't have interest in being a faculty member on her survey, but when we talked to her, she said that she was torn and that I want to do it because I really want to mentor and work with students. I want to teach. I like teaching. I like being in front of a group of students and talking to them about research, but I don't love research. But I really like doing the research. Not even like, I really love it, you know, just having an impact on people. So for her, it was really trying to make sense of, as an individual, where she wanted to be able to balance her time. I think some of the slight differences, though, is that we saw some of our participants taking that one step further and saying that they not only wanted to teach students, they wanted to contribute to increasing diversity in their field, that they wanted to reach out and teach and mentor underrepresented populations, and they felt like there was no space for that and no room for that if they wanted to be faculty members. So we see in this quote from Jaden, my focus now is trying to take my understanding of science and using that for something that's more, I guess, immediately gratifying and immediately applicable. So instead of having some esoteric paper be cited by someone 20 years from now and maybe used for something that will lead to more science, I want to use it for things like, you know, science education or, you know, let's say an increase in the number of underrepresented students in the sciences. So not being able to see ways that they could really live out these values within an academic career ultimately seemed to influence folks' interests away from having these particular positions. So if we think about like where does this leave us, right? And we can discuss that more in a little bit. But I think that ultimately our work on this particular study has really pushed us to rethink inclusion and sense of belonging and what it means. That oftentimes when we talk about climate, we're looking for the big, horrible, terrible things. And it doesn't seem that that's what our participants are talking about. They're talking about the difference between not being fully excluded, but just not feeling included. And what does that mean for us to be mindful of not only not excluding people, but actively including them and making sure that they feel a part of things. And then the second piece that I'd like to highlight is that climate frameworks can really include and address not only specific campus environments, but science more generally. That we can start thinking about the norms and the things that we say that we value, but understand whether or not those things actually are value neutral, that they can be connected to identity in meaningful ways, and then really start rethinking how systems ultimately are going to have to change to accommodate multiple types of impact that students want to make on their communities. Okay, everybody still with me? Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit and talk about efforts to actually address climate. So folks who have been hired in particular positions in campus communities to try to promote diversity in graduate education and how climate fits into that work. So we called these individuals graduate diversity officers. And in some ways, we didn't know what to call them, so we just kind of coined a new term. So it probably is very helpful to explain to you folks who these folks are, and I'm sure you work with many of them already. So it's distinct from the Chief Diversity Officer, who's the individual that we see as responsible for diversity and equity initiatives across a campus community, right? And campuses are increasingly getting these roles. But these are individuals that are hired with different titles, they're in different positions across the organizational chart. Some of them are particularly in departments or in colleges, some of them work in the graduate school, but their main role is to really think about how they're going to increase diversity in graduate education specifically. I see them in many cases as being a student affairs, academic affairs hybrid, and you'll understand a little bit more why after you see some of the data on what they do. And they work on both recruitment and retention related issues, right? So we had a couple folks in our sample who actually had faculty positions while they were engaging in these roles, but the majority of them were working full-time on graduate diversity initiatives at the college level, the departmental level, or the university level. So if we start thinking about retention in graduate education and how these folks might be able to factor into that process, we've done very little theorizing about retention in graduate education, but I really do like Lovett's model of retention. She starts with the notion of academic and social integration. Have folks ever heard of Tinto's theory of retention? Anybody in the room? A couple people? So it starts there, right? This notion that for folks to continue to want to stay in a campus environment, they have to be integrated academically, right? They have to feel that academic passion, that academic connection. And they also have to feel connected socially, that they need to feel like they have community, that they have connections to individuals, whether it be their peers or to faculty members. Lovett actually suggests that in graduate education, it's academic integration that's really the linchpin, that social integration is helpful, but not necessarily as critical, but that academic integration, which happens largely through interactions with faculty members, is really at the foundation of this model. She suggests that, she adds on to it that, okay, academic and social integration are really important, but there's this other piece, this development of cognitive maps of an understanding of how graduate education functions, what you need to do, what boxes you need to check, that ultimately is also really important as well. That you can have these wonderful relationships, but without the kind of insider knowledge of how to navigate, then you're not going to be able to do the work that you need to do. That there are global cognitive maps, so how does your program work? How does your department work? How are you ultimately going to check all the boxes that you need to check to be able to graduate? And then there's the local cognitive maps around like departmental politics and how you interact with people and all that other good stuff. And of course, all of it is recursive and relates to one another. So the extent to which you're integrated ultimately leads to the development of better cognitive maps. And having good cognitive maps ultimately allows you to get integrated better. That make sense? So it all kind of fits together. So while Lovett's model offers us a really great framework, she doesn't talk as much about identity, and she doesn't talk as much about climate. So she offers us this way to understand how folks can navigate through graduate education and ultimately be retained, but doesn't talk as much about how climate or identity might interfere with some of these processes. So we looked back at our data that we collected from these graduate diversity officers. There were 14 of them. It was a national sample. They were at 11 different institutions. So some of them, we talked to a couple folks who were all at the same institution, and there would be like an institutional level person and a couple people in like different departments or programs. And it was a qualitative multi-case study. So again, we conducted interviews and we collected a demographic questionnaire from them. When we asked them about what their perceptions were, so I think this study is particularly interesting because we're not talking to students, we're not talking to faculty, we're talking to people who are looking at students and faculty and giving their impressions of what they see going on, right? So I think it offers a unique perspective on graduate education. So when we asked them what they perceived some of the challenges were in relation to retention for underrepresented populations, for communities of color in their graduate programs, they talked about compositional diversity, right? They just talked about underrepresentation being difficult in terms of increasing underrepresentation, that in some ways it was a cyclical problem. They talked about, much like we saw in the Black scientist data, that there was a lack of student diversity, and that ultimately could lead to isolation, that folks felt like they were the only, that they felt like they were out there on their own, that it was really hard to connect. They also talked about the lack of faculty diversity and how, in particular, there were a couple institutions where they had lost some faculty from underrepresented backgrounds in recent years, and how that was perceived by students as a lack of institutional commitment. that they didn't necessarily feel like the institutions cared about folks who looked like them because their faculty members were leaving. The other things that they talked about were the behavioral and the psychological climate. So in terms of the behavioral climate, a lot of what they talked about was the relationships, again, between PIs and their students. And they talked about how, that didn't just stay between PIs and students, that it often got spread across campus, or that it often came up in conversations as they were trying to recruit new students. So the relationship quality piece and how marginalization could show up in relationships became something of public knowledge across campus. So we see here, and ultimately made people feel less like they could fit. So this first quote here says, "I'd probably say the biggest barrier is the students that have a negative experience. More times than not, it's the department or certain faculty in the department that cause the negative experience, and that's one of the greatest challenges. I think our research product is great, but our relation product sucks." Right? So they could do all the amazing work in the whole world, but if they weren't having good, meaningful relationships, then that was going to ultimately be problematic. The second piece that graduate diversity officers talked about was, again, not having that unique understanding of the experiences of communities of color, and faculty members or departments not necessarily understanding that that process was going to look different for them. So we have a quote here that says, "I think that has a huge impact on our ability to retain when we're in departments where people don't get that there's a separate set of acclimation issues for women or for people of color or for anybody who's not in the majority." So that lack of acknowledgement and lack of willingness to engage the fact that folks are going to have different experiences ultimately served as a barrier. So when we took a step back and looked at, well, okay, so you have these barriers and you have these challenges, what are you actually doing? How are you engaging this work to try to foster retention? It seemed that they were doing three things that ultimately fit together. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about each of these things in a moment. So the first was developing individual relationships with students. The second was serving as intermediaries, cultivating student-faculty relationships. And then the final was engaging in community development. So when we say individual relationships, it's the straight up and down supporting students, right? Serving as a resource for students. Again, many of these folks were engaging in recruitment and retention related work. So they had developed relationships with students over very long periods of time. And they had become a trusted counselor to these students in many cases. So students would come in and share their challenges with them, and these individuals very much felt like part of their relationship, and this is more the student affairs piece, was to be there to support students and to kind of help them along. The second piece was serving as an intermediary, and this ultimately was with the interest of trying to develop some of those academic integration pieces, right? Helping to decode some of the things that ultimately can happen between faculty members and students. So the first thing they talked about was, one person in particular talked about starting a program where they had mentoring coaches, that ultimately they were taking senior graduate students, and those senior graduate students were working with a cohort of PIs who wanted to develop their skills as mentors, and that they were offering them insight and guidance on how to work with the students that they were working with. The second was having open conversations and translating. So some of these graduate diversity officers talked about students coming into their offices and being upset about something, and then having to explain, like, well, your PI did this or did that for this reason, in a way that you may not fully understand. One graduate diversity officer talked about hosting an event called "When Your Professor Says X, They Really Mean Y," and having a panel of faculty members sit down and answer questions very frankly about, okay, when you ask me this question, here's how I might respond, or also giving them insight to the full range of their responsibilities in a given day and why they may not be able to be as responsive. So that it's something that may not feel good on the short term, helping them understand how that might be developmental in the long term. And then the final piece, and the piece that I would say was the largest part of their job, was engaging in community development. That they were trying to move from having this sense of isolation, from taking one student in one program, to developing institutional community. How could you bring students together from across campus to make them feel like they were less alone and like they had more fit, in the sense of campus being a big place where you could see lots of people who looked like you? They did this largely by coupling activities for social integration with cognitive map development. So if they were going to have a workshop on grant writing, there would always be food, There would be time beforehand for folks to engage, and there'd be time after for folks to engage. It was rare that it was just, we're going to provide you with some information and send you on your way, or we're just going to have a social event. It was almost always that these activities were coupled together to help students develop relationships and also develop insights and information. So, as they engaged in these 3 different components, what stood in their way and what was the most challenging? First, that they were overworked. That they felt like there was a really inconsistent institutional commitment and felt like because they were responsible for graduate diversity, that they were responsible for graduate diversity. That oftentimes there weren't other folks who were contributing and chipping in, and they had to focus on it on their own. As you see here in this quote, "It just can't be my job. It's too big a job. It's a lot for one person." They also talked about struggles with faculty relationships. Again, they acknowledged that this academic integration piece was really important and was something that they couldn't do on their own. They could serve as intermediaries, they could try to help support students as they engaged with faculty members, but they couldn't serve as a replacement for a faculty member or for a PI, that relationship was really important, and that ultimately it required a faculty member to be committed and engaged. They talked about, again, similar to the quote that you saw earlier, a lack of support and understanding of the unique challenges facing underrepresented minority students, and that it was really difficult to form collaborations with faculty members unless it was near the time for grant submission or renewal. That often was a critical time to get engaged with faculty because they needed to say on their training grants that they had worked on diversity recruitment, diversity outreach, diversity retention types of activities. And that often was the prime time to get a faculty member to make a commitment to collaborate with you. And then the final piece was financial resources, that they observed their institutions not necessarily giving them the money and the financial resource to be able to do some of the work that they wanted to do. Several of these individuals were hired on soft money, so their positions weren't necessarily permanent. And as you can see in this one particular quote, you can say all kinds of wonderful things, but we all know your money is how you show where your real priorities are. So they really were calling for their institutions to commit their time and their talents and their resources to being able to do this work very well. So for this particular study, some insights, some lingering questions that we had. We noticed that there's this overlap between climate-related barriers for the students, the things that the graduate diversity officers observed as being challenging for students, and the challenges that they had for them as they were trying to engage in their work. Right? We saw this continued question about institutional commitment and how institutions were demonstrating that they were indeed committed, that they wanted to do this work, and how faculty members were engaging with them. That there was a centrality in relationship development and cross-campus community development, that they were really trying to think outside of individual departments and colleges to think about diversity and equity in a broad sense in terms of creating a sense of fit and having the campus feel welcoming. And then finally, that there was this importance of institutional commitment, not just in words, but also in actions. So I think if we looked at many of our institutional mission statements, in there somewhere we would see diversity, equity, for a greater world, training future leaders. We would see all of that type of language. But they wanted their institutions to move beyond language and really invest time and resources and shift from an over-reliance on them and their work. That they really wanted diversity to be everybody's job, not just their job. So I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions and answers, and as I wrap up, just some closing thoughts and some questions for us to consider. As we think about the relationship between climate and student outcomes, I think it's really important that we recenter social engagement and relationships in our conversations about students. That we often think about students and their academic performance, whether they're making good academic progress, but their personal relationships and whether or not they feel a sense of fit in their environments ultimately is going to have a relationship on their ability to do good work. I think it's really important for us to think about how we can engage faculty in this work in meaningful ways, that it cannot just be the work of folks that we hire external to the faculty to do this work, that we have to figure out how to incentivize, how to encourage, how to convince, whatever terms we want to use, faculty members to really be committed and connected to this work as well. Are there ways that we can articulate the difference between excluding and actively including? How can we reinforce that they really are the conduit for academic integration and the critical centrality of their role in their students' development? And then finally, how do we really start thinking in terms of campus-wide communities? As I mentioned earlier, in the undergraduate research, when we talk about climate, we're talking about campus climate. In many ways, I think these tools and models make more sense in terms of science or particular colleges and departments and programs when we're talking about graduate education. But how can we think beyond our colleges and our programs with graduate education? I know when I was a graduate student, I went to one building and I came home. One building and I came home, right? Like, how do we start getting students to have the opportunity to think just beyond their programs, even though those relationships are critically important to form, to thinking about the other relationships they can form on campus that ultimately might have them feel like they have a better set of fit in the academy. Thank you so much. That's my presentation.